Hello, and welcome to the People Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth, and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larson.
So, Rob, thank you very much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm not doing too bad, Tom. Thank you for coming here today. It's been a hefty slog and set up all the equipment for the interview. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. I've got it as light as I can, the setup, but it still is a fair amount of kit.
This is as light as it gets.
Yeah, this is as light as it gets, but we got there in the end.
I just expected somebody to rock up with just their phone recording and just let's do this.
Oh yeah, I've got all the gear and no idea. It's definitely one of those podcasts at the moment.
It's so good, man. Everyone needs to start somewhere, and I know you've been busy. You're doing a few more, so I'm not even the first one.
No, not at all. So no, it's all good, and really grateful for you to have us here. Really, we've known each other for quite some time now. Back to the days of the St Foundation, and working together really closely there. And you personally, and obviously St Mungo's do some amazing and impactful work. So I'm really grateful for you taking the time just to kind of speak to us today and tell us a little bit more about St Mungo's and also you personally about why you do what you do. So maybe initially we could kind of start at the top and why do you kind of do what you do, and maybe give us a bit of an intro to St Mungo's as well.
Cool. No, that's no problem at all. I mean, it's hard to think that 3 years ago, we were working together on the St Foundation partnership. I think I've been here for 6 years, coming up to 7 now. So it wasn't long since I'd started that we started working together. And that kind of goes into the why I do what I do and where I do it. So I'm not sure if this will be on the introductory kind of sheets or anything like that. So just for the context of the people who might be listening, I am an account manager at St Mungo's. I work in the partnerships team. My job is to work with companies of all different sizes, shapes, to kind of figure out how we can leverage their support to better help the people who are rough sleeping or homeless or at risk of homelessness. And that can take many different shapes and forms. I'll go into that maybe in a little bit more detail as to what, who and why. St Mungo's just as a top line for a lot of people who, again, might not know about us. We're one of the largest homelessness charities in the country. We stand alongside others like Shelter and like Centre Point. Everyone's got their own specialisation and niche. If you were to ask me in a short space what St Mungo's is, it is literally just trying to get people as quickly off the streets into specialist accommodation, providing a complete recovery journey and helping them to rebuild their lives. That's the kind of gist of it. But again, I'm happy to dig into that a little bit more. For me personally, why I got into this, so I studied, I'll be completely honest. First, I studied physics at university and really didn't enjoy it. I loved physics at, A-level when it was all a little bit more kind of you'd watch something on BBC, which is like the stars in the sky, and you're just like, wow, stars. That was all fun and games. And then when you get to university, it was like, oh, there's a lot more number crunching involved, and this isn't as fun, this isn't as amazing, imaginative for me anymore. So struggled with that. Dropped out of physics. Then I went on to study law at Aberystwyth University in Wales. I went on to go into a postgrad, which is human rights law, and that's kind of where all of this kicked off. So I started to get more of an interest into third sector organisations and how they support people just across asylum and immigration. My master's dissertation was actually on that, looking at how we treat people who are seeking asylum in this country. I'll save that for another podcast. And just trying to think about how I might help with that. And there was an organisation that needed some funds raised for it. They were a great organisation. It was legal support for people who needed just helping hand, had limited language and support needs. And they just, cash strapped, I think is the best way to put it. So many wonderful organisations that do incredible work, they just didn't get the funding to do their jobs. So I started fundraising for them, and that kind of indirectly led to me jumping from any kind of semblance of that into fundraising. I came to London because this is where most of the fundraising jobs are. It's got better over the last few years, and started out in events fundraising, which is looking at how, it was for a cancer charity that worked with families and relatives of very young children and adults who had very serious cancer diagnosis. And my first job there was to put on a family fun day, which sounds like, kind of like quite an easy thing to kind of do. But it was already in motion when I joined. And, I was very conscious of the fact that all these people in these very difficult circumstances have travelled from all across the country just to connect with like-minded individuals and kind of like blow off some steam and have a nice space for their children, where their children aren't, they're not different from the other kids in any way. They were just like, seeing what was going on. They were enjoying themselves there. And just providing that and seeing the impact of that on people, and working with, at the time, a corporate partner to deliver that, I just really enjoyed it. And that kind of like set me up. So here I stand now, 6-7 years on from that, 7-8 years on from that. And I haven't looked back really. So that's the gist of it.
No, well, it's amazing. And I didn't realise you studied human rights at the start of your career, and it kind of all stems from there. But it's really good to understand that, because, as you say, you can see a real thread that runs through everything you do and really drives you on a personal level. And that must feel good now to be in that fundraising position where you can kind of make a difference and have some real impact really with those partnerships. Yeah,
it feels fantastic. And the best part is about our jobs a lot of the time is it has its difficulties. Every job has got its own challenges, and sometimes like instability is always tricky to move around, and there's always wider context to our homelessness work, and I just do a small slice of it with fundraising and the corporate partnerships that we work with. But it is really fulfilling to see things take root and grow and see that we are having an impact. And I would say, like, the people that we have the pleasure to work and meet with, in companies of all different stripes, again, like, they can be some of the most wonderful, like warm-hearted, caring people, and they want to make a difference. They just don't necessarily know how, or maybe they do know how and have the resources, but just not in the context of homelessness. And I always bear in mind, like, it's almost like a truism for me. So the reason I got into cancer and healthcare as my first kind of charity steps, and later into homelessness, is because it was a personal kind of connection for me, because I grew up in like a council estate. My mum benefited from the right to buy your own house after, we grew up in a council estate. Eventually she bought a house on another council estate, and it was wonderful. The community was really warm, but there's no getting around the fact that there was some definite kind of issues with buying groceries and things like that, and other kids with their new uniforms and stuff like that. Always a bit of a challenge for my mum, and she was a single parent, so it was always quite challenging for her to manage that. So I always kind of knew growing up what the benefits were of having like a strong safety net for certain things. Wiggle that. There you go. It's back on screen. So having a strong social safety net for things like access to healthcare, to access to housing, to access to food. I had free school meals. Like, if we didn't have those, I don't know what we would have done. So, like, always in my mind, the kind of like thread has been, we want to set people up to succeed, but you've got to provide a strong safety net to prevent the worst damage occurring to people some people are more vulnerable than others. And just being part of that work at St Mungo is a real privilege. We work with some incredible people.
Yeah. Yeah. And just on that point then, because, St Mungo's sort of stated mission statement is got two pillars really. One, which is about, ending homelessness in its broadest sense. And the second is being about rebuilding lives. And what you're describing there kind of ties into that, doesn't it? You talk about a net, you talk about a system that kind of goes around these things. And our work together through the Stanhope Foundation, that was more in the kind of rebuilding lives category, wasn't it? With your recovery college. And I think, maybe you could give people an understanding about the breadth of the work and maybe the challenge that goes into this, because it's not a kind of one size fits all or a kind of targeted approach that's needed, really, is it?
And that's the tricky thing a lot of people misunderstand about our work is, they just think there is a single solution for homelessness, and I won't do it here now to some degree, just because, my presentations that I do to partners and show to people is, when you start breaking it down, homelessness is incredibly complex, and you need a really comprehensive solutions-based approach to really kind of address people in the way that they need support, like not just kind of throwing things at the wall and just hoping that they stick. St Mungo's got 50 years of expertise. Other organisations, again, have got like decades and decades of knowledge in their specific areas. So there's a lot of partnership work that goes on. I guess in terms of St Mungo's impact, one thing is quite important to say, again, for the scale. A lot of people don't understand the scale of the work that we do. So just over the last year, St Mungo's worked with just under 25,000 people. I think it's like 24,900 or so people. And we work with just under 2,900 people every single night. So that's people who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. So we're talking large numbers of people, largely based in London, but also regionally in Bristol, Reading, Oxford, Brighton, various regions where we know that there's a need for us to go into to support with whatever is missing from the rehabilitation support services there. And yeah, just to kind of give a potted understanding for a lot of our listeners, it is complex needs a lot of the time. You get people who are exposed to homelessness because of, they just couldn't make rent that month. And they find themselves homeless because of that. And other people, it's something that's been building up for a while. It could be that, they experience trauma or abuse as children, which means that like later on, even if they have overcome that trauma to some degree, it can mean that if they encounter further stressors or trigger factors, can bring all that back. Mental health needs, substance abuse needs. We work extensively with the prison system. We work with people who are seeking refuge, women who are fleeing abuse and persecution. So like there's all different needs. And again, this is a very shorthand form of kind of summary, but you've really got to make sure that your support is tailored, because at the end of the day, you don't have just one chance to support a person. Like we don't give up on people. They might go through our program multiple times before it's successful, but it's easiest and best if you get that to succeed the first time, if that person doesn't return to the streets, because it can take a lot of trust and faith to begin that journey in the first place. And trust and faith can be in short supply, for people who have been rough sleeping for a long time, where they might have been moved on consistently. I mean, I know everyone's got a job to do, and that goes for people working in local boroughs and areas where their instructions or their knowledge might be to move a person on. But we try and take that opportunity to engage with the person and offer them a solution to leave the streets behind, to come into our services where we have capacity to do so, and then kind of offer them a lifeline and a roadmap to actually recovering and becoming independent. Again, that's the ultimate objective. We don't want people to stay in our services long term. I've got more detail to share perhaps on the employment side of things, but I also need to take a breath.
Yeah. No, well, in everything that you do, you were talking about trust there, and maybe we'll come on to that in a second, but you and the people at St Mungo's, you've got a real good understanding about people and seeing people at their most vulnerable. And often that's, when phrases like people's true colours, you can kind of see a lot of things about people when they're in those types of positions. Yeah. And so in summary, what are some of the key things that come to mind when you think about what you've learned about people in general from doing the work that you do?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's one of those things where you only get to know a person truly when they're like under stress, or when you're under stress yourself and you ask them for support. I suppose over the years, I've had the pleasure to visit a lot of St Mungo services, to do a lot of volunteering. I've volunteered extensively at our Recovery College, which is our learning and education platform, to kind of deliver some digital classes there. Mine was specifically on presentations and confidence building, because, again, this is getting off the point, but when it came to delivering these classes, you're almost like sneaking in the personal development side of things. That sounds really sly, but the idea there is okay, cool. It's about delivering a presentation confidently to X number of people. That's something a lot of us don't have to do. What does that equip you to do? It equips you to go into a interview panel where there's multiple people talking to you. That's a weird and strange environment. It always is. A lot of people, no matter how senior and professional you are, when you sit down in front of an interview panel, it's a bit of a shock to the system. So it can be very tricky, and it's looking at opportunities like that. Okay, what can this teach? So it isn't just about presentation. It's talking confidently to your friends about what your passions and hobbies are, and finding value in what you like, and being prepared to talk about it and communicate these ideas. So it's almost okay, the crux is confidence building, is a presentation, but it builds all these skills and your self-confidence and belief over a period of time, and gets you to socialize with the other clients and just got to wheel that again, with the other clients and the people who are taking part in that class, where you might not have had that interaction with a lot of people. Again, like we said before, building that relationship of trust can take time. And, you know, when you meet people who are sleeping, they are in survival mode. They're in a place where they don't necessarily know what tomorrow is going to bring. A lot of people have been rough sleeping for a while will have accrued knowledge of how to survive on the streets. Now they'll take pride in that, and they'll have formed social connections as well. So they will feel strongly in position to deal with what is coming their way. They don't necessarily know what that is, and in terms of looking forward to the future, that isn't something that everyone's in a position to do. And particularly, like, you know, on the streets, people are exposed to horrific levels of violence from people who are sleeping rough themselves or from the public. So it's quite, you know, people don't necessarily want to be found either. So when we're talking about finding people at the first instance on the streets, when you're finding that person, you don't know what situation they're going to be in. You've got to be very careful, and you've got to be very thoughtful about how you approach it. We've got some absolutely incredible, they're basically angels is the best way I can put it. Like in our outreach teams who go out morning and night looking for people who are rough sleeping, we have volunteers who do the same thing, and their job is to make that connection, to very gently, firstly it's just spotting them, making sure that we can actually find them effectively, because boroughs are big and our teams aren't huge, and approaching that cautiously and just assertively and saying to them, like, look, what can we do to help you? What does your journey look like? And building that up with them. First, I think, is just getting them into accommodation, emergency accommodation, and then triaging, assessing their needs, connecting them with a person that we call a caseworker, who's responsible for their overall journey through St Mungo services, and connecting them with things like the recovery college I just mentioned before, and classes that will support and rebuild their lives, finally trying to get them to move into independent accommodation. So yeah, in terms of where we find people and their needs, I always just say, like, imagine yourself at your worst day and, you know, how much help you needed, and then imagine that being even worse, where, like, you know, a lot of the things we take for granted in terms of stability, you know, if something bad goes wrong, it's usually one thing in isolation. You know, imagine multiple things going wrong, or not even having the stability for a fallback position. Like, you know, you might not have strong friends and family connections where you can be like, oh, can I stay on your couch for a week or two? You might not have any money in the bank which says, oh, I don't have to worry about lunch tomorrow, because even if I get turfed out of my house, I can still afford food in a hotel. That your job is unstable, and then maybe, like, you know, you've got existing mental health needs, and, you know, we know mental health issues in the country have been exacerbated, particularly over the last few years. So maybe more people will know what I'm talking about when I say this. I've encountered it many times in my life where, you know, where these things are all lining up at the same time, it becomes very, very difficult to surmount them. And that's where that helping hand, that support system, that safety net needs to come in. So that was a long answer.
No, but it's, you know, it's amazing what you and as you say, particularly the frontline people here do, and it's an incredibly skilled and you know, sensitive role that they have to take, isn't it? And there's a lot of empathy needs to be shown, and to build that trust. And, you know, a lot of our listeners here are working or interested in the built environment, and you could say that there's a disconnect within the built environment between the industry and maybe the communities in which some of these projects happen, and sometimes there's an element of a lack of trust or a need to kind of get closer to one another. So what do you think you've learned then about trust as a theme, and some of the kind of practical steps maybe to kind of building that maybe are applicable to listeners and to other kind of areas of life, really?
I mean, there's a few ways to tackle that question. I'd say, like, just on a personal level, I'd say firstly, like, in terms of, you know, if you look at, like, the journey our clients go through, I think there are some valuable lessons there about, you know, being, you know, kind of like not giving up on people, but also being ready to reach out for help yourself, being very important key steps that we don't always feel ourselves equipped to do so. A little bit of a case of, you know, we realise for a lot of people, you know, we grow up with these biases, like the ideas about homelessness that we encounter. When I give a presentation all the time, you know, people don't feel necessarily equipped or that they can say this in a public space. But when I've spoken to people one-on-one, there's a lot of misunderstandings about homelessness, what leads people to become homeless, how responsible they are for it themselves, what the solutions are. And in a similar way, when you're looking at integrating homelessness support services into a local community, it can be very easy to see resistance to that, I think. And, fair enough as well, because like for the community's perspective, it can be that you don't know what that looks like, what shape that can be. You can read horror stories online, and online's always the worst place to find information at the drop of a hat, particularly when things are there's strong feelings around them, because it can be very easy, like, one bad example case study can kind of balloon into, this is the one that pops to the top every time you search. This is the bad story, so to speak. But, our teams work really carefully with local communities and with the GLA and the government to try and make sure that we offer these support services. And I'd say even beyond that, frankly, like if we do see ourselves as a society where we do offer support to one another and we see that as important, I think some forbearance needs to be baked in to some degree. It can't just be I really think this support is great, but as long as it doesn't impact me or is close to me or affect me in any way, you do see that consistently across like third sector work in general, or even things like, council housing and different things like that, different social initiatives. You need to take a wider view and say, like, hey, what is the role of my smaller community within that? How do we work with these organisations? How are we fine with it? How am I personally fine with it? Do I need to challenge my own perceptions and negative narratives? I realise that there are difficulties there, but at the end of the day, if you see it as a community, then we have to confront this. And London's a very built-up city. Like, it does feel like we're all living on top of each other, which does exacerbate this to some degree. I think we do need to probably look a little bit more about how obviously there's been various pledges and things like that in the news, even recently, about how we tackle house building and property. We do need to build more houses. We do need to alleviate some of these issues and problems. Be maybe less central on London could be a way of looking at it. But I'll leave that to the policy team to kind of push that point a little bit more.
No, thanks, Rob. And, we had Heather Macy from Architects Aware on this podcast a few weeks ago. And she talked about, every one of us is only ever kind of 3 steps from homelessness. Yep. And that builds, a huge amount of kind of, should build a huge amount of empathy with people, shouldn't it? In terms of being able to relate to people who are going through that at any point in time, and just sort of taking the opportunity really to do what we can, in the roles that we've got, and try to make some impact where we can. And as you say, that may be something, very, very immediate, like, some of the great people who volunteer for you, going out and speaking to people who are on the streets, or it might just be about doing something within your sphere of influence to try and make a positive difference. Yeah. And hopefully some of that is going to start to happen, but it also takes sort of organisations and people to approach some of these discussions that historically, haven't really been part of core business to talk about, and to try and work in partnership in the way that you do is a really good way to approach that, isn't it? Yeah, we do find a great deal of success with our partners. So, we do raise a large sum of money every year. St Mungo's total income as an organisation is £180 million, and fundraising, we make up a good chunk of that. But overall, our specific niche is to find partners who can support projects that might not be funded by government projects or other sources of income. So we take a slice out of that to say, okay, well, what do we need to find funding for specifically? Things like the Recovery College, which are all funded by voluntary sources. We try and find projects like that and just say, okay, how do we best support this? And then line up partnerships to support that in kind. And what that looks at is that a financial donation, like a strict financial donation? Some organisations are happy to do that and keep it at that level of relationship. Others want to get more involved with that specific project. Others want to see work across the board, like they might fund, say, for example, our education or employment team work, but want to see outreach or what our accommodation services look like, and get their volunteers involved in turn as well. We do have a wonderful volunteering program ourselves as well. So we have a wonderful volunteering coordinator. I'll repeat myself, but it's the only word I can really think of to describe Ellie. She works really hard to find opportunities in our services where meaningful volunteering can take place. So what does that look like? That's, it could be repainting, repairing a garden or inside a service. It can be
cooking meals for our clients at special occasions. It can be teaching skills in our classes, our digital online classes. It can be over winter, wrapping up presents, delivering them to our services. Just a little thing to say that, somebody is thinking of you. It's all these little bits across the year that kind of add up and, allow us to really deliver some great value for the overall charity. And I'd say, like, in part, I would like to think that, we'll have more scope in the near future to look at maybe project partnerships that do tie a more strategic element to our work. So addressing some of these problems, like with outreach, if there's less emergency accommodation, helping to look at spaces which a partner might be designing or working on and saying, what can we do to integrate St Mungo's support and services into that a little bit more readily? I think everyone at the organisation is ready to do it. It's always a matter of capacity, because our teams here do work really hard and they are run quite lean. But we have some fantastic success stories, and it's just a matter of like key people across organisations putting in the time and having the scope to really explore those. Mm-hmm. Is this done as part of a person's job, or is it a person's dedicated role to look at this? Do they have the freedom and the time to put effort into it? Because we will match that.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and that's a great commitment from St Mungo's, and it's basically really just about taking action, isn't it? And trying to do something, in some small part that can make a difference. And on a personal level, I know from experience, you take a massive amount out of that as well. It gives you a sense of purpose, sense of meaning, and sense of contribution, which is really good on a personal level as well. So, yeah.
I think a lot of people get a lot out of it. Like, the feedback we get from volunteering days is lovely. I think, people might have done volunteering days before. And the tricky thing is always, and this is, I'm not going to labour too long on this, but for charities, a lot of the time, volunteering can be quite tricky because you don't have a huge array of services, and it's often somebody's home or somewhere personal where you don't want people to necessarily go. We do have opportunities where somebody can go into, like I say, a garden, a shared space where we do some horticultural training through our Putting Down Roots programme, get to see that firsthand, get involved in that, making that space better for our clients. And the feedback we get is wonderful. People enjoy it. They get to feel connected and understand our work. They can act as advocates in their own right and start to understand, you develop that empathy for a difficult and complex situation, but you also start to ask, what can we do ourselves a bit more than this? It's always a journey, I think, for everything with these things.
Yeah.
Which one did you, was it like a cooking day for you, or was it some time ago now? So.
Yeah, I have done that, but also, our present wrapping that we would do at Christmas and stuff was always, a great event. And, you'd see a massive turnout of people from all different levels of the industry. You get very senior people coming down to spend their time wrapping presents, when otherwise you probably couldn't get a meeting with people like that for months. And it just shows, people really do want to kind of, make an impact if they can, I think. And it's just providing, enabling some of that impact to happen, I think, through ventures like the St Foundation or the Grow Foundation, as we've got now. On this podcast, we have a final tradition, which is where the previous guests ask a question for the next guest. So I'll ask you to write one down for the following guest as well, coming after this. So our previous guest asks, what is your most surprising skill which relates to your work?
Wow. They really waded in hard there, didn't they? Did. So who was it who did this the last podcast? I want to send them an email thanking them for this very generous question. Exactly. No, that is a great question. I guess for me, really, like, I guess growing up as a kid, I always struggled with empathy myself. Like, I was the kid who would always like sit down with Lego bricks and just ignore other humans. Like, literally that's who I was. And I struggled with that I wouldn't say struggled with that. I was happy in my own way. And then I think it was only truly in my 20s, empathy really started to kick in a little bit more. And I'd say, like, once you get that skill, once you start to understand other people's motivations, and you start to, one last time, when you start to like really connect with people, I think that's like it's probably the greatest thing in life, quite frankly, because it just adds so much colour to your feelings and opening yourself up like that. But I would say, like, also, like, in terms of the work that we do, it does help you kind of want to go the extra mile and think about what more that you can do, and kind of like, hopefully, when you're talking to people, it comes across and they go, okay, cool. Well, you're not just reading this from just like a long list of like bullet points, but they actually believe in this to some degree, at least, where they can say, okay, cool. Well, they might not be an expert, but they are a representative of experts and they can talk confidently about all the different ways that I can get involved. And if you can get that across to people, I think, and you can build that understanding and that awareness, I mean, that's the best part about my role, and that's where I think that skill came in, and I'm glad I got it because it wasn't always a given. I think it's harder to develop empathy than people think it is sometimes.
Yes, yeah. Well, I can attest to that as well, and it's an ever-evolving skill, isn't it, that you kind of learn, and hopefully through life all become a bit wiser and kind of a bit more empathetic, really.
Particularly when somebody steps on the back of your shoes when you're going through the London Underground tubes.
Exactly.
Or just like barges onto the tube and it's already full. Or things like that. Test your empathy. Just remember they're probably having a bad day themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well, Rob, that's a great answer, and it's a great way to end the podcast.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for your time and for all the work you do personally and that St Mungo's do. It's amazing, and it's helping so many people. And word to everyone out there to try and support St Mungo's and other organisations where you can.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. Cheers.
Thanks for the opportunity.
No worries. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the People Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.